Hello, welcome to this short presentation, which is a flight simulator mock-up, a model, developed by my colleague Chris Percy. And it's based on our research on the history and heritage of the Ancholme Valley and the River Ancholme north of Brigg, largely. And what you're going to see will be a flyover of the valley at different times in history. Some of this is based on contemporary aerial photographs, place names, interpretation of landscape. Some of it is based on 19th century ordnance survey maps that show a great deal of field systems and settlements and some of the small car woodlands and things of that nature. And then there's also the map that I've referred to in other presentations, which shows both the modern canalised river, either New Ancholme, heading due north from deep in the heart of Lincolnshire to the Humber Estuary. And excitingly, it also shows the river, the old River Ancholme, much of which is still there. The watercourse is still there. And it shows that as it was probably in the late 1600s into the 1700s. So I shall talk through some aspects of this. I'm going to share screen so that you can see the presentation. And here we are. We're flying over the Ancholme, heading south down the Ancholme Valley in the modern landscape. And you can see the extensive flatlands. To either side, there's raised ground of the Lincolnshire Wolds and the edge between the Ancholme Valley and the major settlements like Scunthorpe. You can see the very, very straight canalised river, but you can also see the old River Ancholme meandering through the present day landscape. And there are some small areas of trees, mainly plantations, associated with fairly grand houses, maybe in the 17 and 1800s. But a lot of the valley now is intensive arable farmland, some small areas of pasture, relatively small, and more diversity as you get away from the modern valley bottom and its more intensive terrain landscape into the slightly more rolling countryside beyond. But you can see some of the main settlements that you will be familiar with to either side of the flight path of our plane. So we're heading south. We're looking into the vast settlement of central Lincolnshire, this agricultural hub, if you like, of Middle England. So we're getting some sort of idea of what this landscape is like. And there are some areas where, for reasons of hydrology and soil, the land use has been less intensive. And you can see little patches of relatively wet, relatively intact marshland and potentially floodland. Now, much of this landscape that we're looking at is actually at or below sea level. You can see here to the west of the area, the woodland, Broughton Wood, fantastic area. And that's on the slightly higher ground. But much of the landscape that we're flying over towards Brigg is at or even below sea level. You can still see the meandering old river there, crossing over the floodplain, leaving areas between the old river and the new river. And you wonder if there's scope in some of these areas to maybe manage those less intensively. Maybe these are areas that can hold the floodwater in times of flood, which are going to come. We will increasingly have both flood and drought. So there are areas that actually between the old river and the new river, which can perhaps provide flood storage capacity and longer term wetter farming landscapes. So these are things which we need to think about and consider in terms of the longer term vision of this landscape. And this has been what our first project was very much about. Here we get to Brigg, which is kind of the centrepiece of the Ancholme Valley. And you can see again the old river meandering away there, and the new river cut straight as an arrow heading south. And then as we come over Brigg, our flight will terminate for this period, and we will shortly turn around and go back over the Ancholme again. And there you see the great Humber in the distance, and the map in the foreground is marked white, not because it's covered in snow or heavy frost or ice, but it's the maps from the mid-19th century, the Victorian Ordnance Survey maps. And these show in great detail the land use at the time. They still show the river, the old river meandering there, and the new cut heading directly towards its discharge point at the River Humber. So from these old maps, we get a very good insight in terms of what the landscape is like. You can see the Broughton decoy there to the left, and we're heading down the river, down the canalised new river, but we can see the old meanders still in place. You can see some of the relatively intimate field systems. On the right now, you can see linear strip fields from the medieval landscape that have been later enclosed. You can see the rectilinear fields of the 17th and 1800 parliamentary enclosures. So these images give us a real insight into how the valley was and how people lived at that time. And of course, one of the things that the Victorians were very, very proud of was their ability to reclaim, and then in inverted commas, to improve and drain landscapes such as wetlands. And the drainage process gets more and more intensive. When it first happens in the 1600s and 1700s, they only have wind power, wind pumps with windmills. And if the wind doesn't blow, you can't pump the water off. So even though the river was canalised and some of the land around was drained, it wasn't drained very effectively. So despite the canalised drained river, the old river was still there, and it was still in a wet landscape. It would have been a mixture of marsh and wet grassland, wet pasture. So here we approach the great River Humber. We can see the settlements on the far bank, and we can also see in front of us, coming into view, Reed's Island. So this really enigmatic feature on the south side of the great River Humber. So it's a really interesting landscape, and it terminates at South Ferriby, where there are control sluices and pumps, and the river discharges to the estuary. And not only that, the flood defences and the sluices guard the present-day Ancholme against incursions from high tides. Now, bear in mind that it's suggested that high tides may be, or tides will perhaps, sea level will perhaps be 1 metre to 2 metres, perhaps higher in the next 100 years. But tidal surges, high points, may be as much as 10 metres over where we are now. So how defensible is some of this land in the next 100 years? So now we're heading down in the mid to late 16th century. Here you can see the river meandering, the new river as it's proposed to be cut. The maps are slightly enigmatic because they're produced in the mid to late 1600s. Whether the drainage and the canalisation occurs at that time, or maybe a little later, is slightly unclear at the present. But you can see the old river, you can see the new canalised river. And the reason they were actually wanting to impose the canalised river onto this landscape was not to drain it, but to improve commerce into the heart of Lincolnshire. You can see there the maps have slipped slightly and the imagery slipped slightly. So those two bits of the new river do actually join. They're not ending blindly. But you can also see much more extensive willow carr. Willow and old carr. There's a handful of veteran white willows left in the landscape today. But in the 16 and 1700s, there would have been extensive willow carr. And this is preserved today in terms of place names, the different areas with the word carr, which is basically a wet woodland. Again, you can see Broughton to the right, to the west of our landscape there. And as we approach Brigg, we will again turn. The landscape beyond is as it is in the present day. We don't have the maps for that. So the image you see in the distance is the modern landscape, and the historic landscape is imposed upon that. But it gives a fascinating insight. And what we've done in the final flyover is we're heading back due north towards the River Humber and suggesting what this landscape would have like pre-drainage and pre-river canalisation during a period of flood. That might be from the sea with a tidal surge. It might be water from the heart of Lincolnshire pouring down into this great valley. And of course, the interesting thing with the Ancholme is it is very much a linear valley. The modern river is the canalised river and it's very straight. But the valley itself is relatively narrow and it's relatively self-contained. This is why it potentially makes a huge opportunity now for rewilding and rewetting. Not to remove farming, but to adapt farming and make farming more resilient to the climate changes that are bound to come, and the sea level changes and the extent of extreme flooding. Extreme events will get bigger and they will get more frequent. So we have an opportunity now to plan ahead 50 years, 100 years perhaps, to start to, in a piecemeal way, refocus, readapt the landscape, the farming, the communities to what will be a wetter, wilder future, but still a vibrant, productive farming landscape. We can actually turn the climate change issues, which is what our present project is about, climate resilience, climate adaptation. We can actually turn some of the climate issues into positives to reduce the impact of climate change, but also to adapt and to grow our communities in the event and in the context of the climate change that is going to come. So we hope you found this informative and interesting and exciting, and we look forward to seeing you and meeting you at some of the meetings. There are calls for people to make climate change pledges, so please look on our website for more information on that. And we are looking to individuals, communities and other groups, landowners in particular, to come to us with ideas of how we can adapt and alter the way we manage the land in a positive way to building climate resilience, to building climate adaptation, and to grow a sustainable community based around a sustainable environment and a sustainable economy. So thank you to Chris, who's designed this. I think it's really interesting, really insightful. And thank you for listening.